The Lord began to speak through Hosea, and the Lord said to him, "Go take for yourself an adulterous wife." That's the same advice Dad gives me every time I'm home. Wait, no, it's not. "And children of unfaithfulness." Why? Because you're going to live out my life, because the land is guilty of the vilest adultery and departing from the Lord. So he married Shazam. That's right, he married Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, which means two cakes, which probably means her price as a temple prostitute was 2 fig cakes. I don't know why that's expensive, but apparently it is, or maybe it's not. "And she conceived and bore him a son. Then the Lord said to Hosea, call him Jezreel," which means God scatters. That's a great name. "Because soon I will punish the house of Jehu for the massacre at Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of Israel. In that day I will break Israel's bow in the valley of Jezreel." We begin this story with the concept of, if God is showing his story through Hosea that we're dealing with unfaithful people, there is a reality of unfaithfulness. Go out, marry a prostitute who will not be faithful to you. And then when you have a son, name him Jezreel, which means nothing to you and I, probably. But Jezreel is an important city in the story of the kings. It was a place of one of the many palaces. It is the city in which Ahab, possibly the most despicable king in the history of either North or South Israel, and his wife, the lovely Jezebel. Not her name, by the way, but her name has been lost to history. All we have is what the prophets called her. This is the city in which they decided that the palace just wasn't big enough. So there was a guy by the name of Naboth right next door who had a vineyard. And Ahab, being the great and powerful king it was, in chapter 21 of 1 Kings, had this interaction. Sometime later, there was an incident involving this vineyard. The vineyard was in Jezreel, close to the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria, or northern tribes of Israel. Ahab said to Naboth, "Let me have your vineyard to use for a vegetable garden, since it is close to my palace. In exchange, I'll give you a better vineyard. Or if you prefer, I'll pay you whatever it's worth." Sounds like a good deal, right? But Naboth replied, "I've read our Old Testament. I've read the books of Moses. I'm not giving up my family's inheritance. There's no way I would do that. That is unethical." So Ahab, the great king, went home, sullen and angry, and because Naboth the Jezreelite said, "I'll not give you my inheritance," he laid on his bed sulking and refused to eat. There you go, folks. That's the king of the nation. Thumb in mouth, crying on his bed because he cannot get a vineyard next door. But he's not the power on the throne. His wife is really the power. She looks at this situation and says, "I'll take care of this." So she sets up an elaborate banquet and has some conspirators, and they sit Naboth in a nice spot, and in the middle of it they falsely accuse him of being a blasphemer. They take him out, they stone him to death. And as soon as she hears it, Jezebel says, down in chapter 21, as soon as she heard this, she said to Ahab, "Get up, take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite." And then he refused to tell you because he's no longer alive, but he's dead. "Happy birthday, honey. I've taken care of this for you." That begins a set of prophecies on this king and on his kingdom, specifically on his wife Jezebel. After Ahab dies, she won't give up her power. She sticks around as the queen mother. And guess what city she chooses to stay in? She's in Jezreel. So when he has to name his child Jezreel, everybody knows the history of the place. Because this is where Jehu, one of the sons of one of the great kings of the south, decided that he would take over. And he would come in and invade. And after he kills Jezebel's son, Jehu went out and ate and drank and said, "Take care of the cursed woman," 2 Kings chapter 9. "Bury her, for she was a king's daughter." But when they went out to bury her, they found nothing except her skull, because they'd thrown her off a roof, off a wall. They went back and told Jehu, "This is the word the Lord had spoken through the servant Elijah the Tishbite. On a plot of ground at Jezreel, dogs will devour Jezebel's flesh." You want to get on God's bad side? I wouldn't. "Jezebel's body will be the refuge on the ground in the plot of Jezreel, so that no one will be able to say, this is Jezebel. And in chapter 10, we find out that Jehu comes in and does great things. The Baals that they worshipped, he knocks down. But there's one problem. He keeps up some golden calves from one of the other religions. And not only keeps them up, he leads the people to worship them. And God says, you're going to last 4 generations. When Ahab is writing, we're in generation 3. Because Jehu was followed by Jehoahaz, Jehoash, Jeroboam, and Zechariah. We're coming to the end of the northern tribe. Zechariah will be assassinated within 6 months, and then it will be a litany of kings killing one another. And God says, here's the story, Hosea, name your first kid Jezreel. Remind everybody of all the great things that have happened there, and also remind them that I am the God who scatters. Then your second child, which she conceived and gave birth again to a daughter. And the Lord said to Hosea, call her Lo Ruhamah. The note at the bottom of your Bible tells you her name. Not loved. Then we get to the faithfulness of Gomer, as in the third child it just says, and when she'd weaned Lo Ruhamah, Gomer conceived? Nope. Gomer had another son. Uh-oh. Guess what? When the Lord said, call him Lo Ami, which means not my people, that's because it was very simple for Hosea to come home when the baby was born and go, that's not my kid. He looks nothing like me or anyone else. And God says, what you're living is the story of me dealing with mankind, specifically the northern tribes and, throughout Hosea, the southern tribes. The holy chosen people of God have been the ones that I will scatter. Why? Because in their hearts, they have run away to the point where I'm not supposed to love them. They have become people who are not my people, though they claim to be my people. You can see poor Hosea. Or maybe Hosea is not around. You know, like, remember the old show Newhart? Here come his kids into town, and Jezreel steps up and goes, hi, I'm God Scathers. This is my sister, not loved. And this is my brother, well, not my brother. Well, we're not really sure what he is, but he's definitely not our people. Probably another word we would use there, but I'm not going to do that. And that's how they introduce his kids. And we find out that very soon after this third child is born, she's gone again, gone back to the old way of living. And then from chapters 4 through 11, God begins to tell the story of him and the people. And it sounds like a man who loves his wife, but she's cheated on him and left him. As there are the moments when there's great bitterness and pain of what God is declaring, and the reason why they all deserve what they're going to get. Chapter 4, Hosea says it this way. Hear the words of the Lord, you Israelites, because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land. There is no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. There's only cursing, lying, murder, stealing, adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. Because of this, the land mourns, and all who live in it waste away. The beasts of the field and the birds of the air and the fish of the sea are dying. But let no man bring a charge. Let no man accuse another, for your people are like those who bring charges against a priest. You stumble day and night. The prophets stumble with you. So I will destroy your mother, because my people are destroyed from a lack of knowledge. They don't have a clue who I am. Because you've rejected knowledge, I also reject you as my holy people. Because you've ignored the law of your God, I will ignore your children. Chapter 13, he says, it's not just that you don't know me and the fact that you live vile lives, but you've forgotten everything I ever did for you. When Ephraim spoke, men trembled. He was exalted in Israel, but he became guilty of Baal worship and died. Now they sin more and more. They make all kinds of idols for themselves from their silver, cleverly fashioned images, all of them the work of craftsmen. It is said of these people, they offer human sacrifices and kiss those calf idols. Therefore, they will be like the morning mist, like the early dew that disappears, like chaff swirling from a threshing floor, like smoke escaping through a window. But I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, and you shall acknowledge no God but me, no Savior except me. God says, they're unfaithful and there's no reason. I took them when there was no one to love them. I brought them in just like Hosea does with his wife. And as a result, they continue to stay far away from me. You know what gets worse for you and I? When we try to figure out what name God will give us, will he give us the name of God scatters? Will he give us the name of not loved? Will he give us the name of not my people? Is when Jesus says God doesn't just look on our outward actions, but in the Sermon on the Mount says God begins to look at our heart. It's not just the fact that you kill someone that makes you a murderer. It's how you start to think about someone. It's the way you use your tongue. It's the way you do these other things that could put us in a position of being unfaithful to God. And the penalty for unfaithfulness is fairly steep, as Jezebel and Jezreel have learned, as the northern tribe will learn when the Assyrians, who they have been trying to love, and at one point in Hosea, God says they reap in the wind, and they, bad week to use this illustration, they sow in the wind and they reap a whirlwind. They don't know what destruction is coming upon them. And if that's the only message in the book, this is a very scary message coming out of the miners. But then God does something else in the book. It's not just the guy who's been jilted, but it's that cry of the one who still loves, even though he has every reason not to. Dan Dyke, who I was the grad assistant for and who I took Old Testament poetry with, said to us as ministry students, he said, when you deal with a man who's going through a wife leaving him, this is exactly the cycle by which it will go. He will be extremely angry, speaking of how things have gone wrong, and then he will speak fondly of those moments and those tender moments and his desire to go back. And he said, there's almost a way in which that's how God handles Israel. With one exception, God is determined that no matter what happens, he will bring his people back. Chapter 2, verse 23, speaking of them, he says, I will then not scatter them, but I will plant her for myself in the land. And I will show my love to the one I called not my loved one, now saying my loved one. I will say to those who are called not my people, you are my people. And the key difference is, and they will turn around and they will now say, you are my God. They will be changed by this. God makes Hosea do it in chapter 3. Hosea shows up. He doesn't go, I want to see the part where he goes to Gomer and says, you picked a fine time to leave me, with 3 hungry mouths to feed and a prophecy that God will fulfill. But I love you still. Hey, when I can't come up with anything else, quote Kenny Rogers. It always works, all right? But instead of going back and begging his wife to come back, Hosea does something that he doesn't have to do. She's his. There's a marriage bond. There's a covenant. There's a commitment between them. All he has to do is say, you're mine. Instead, he pays the purchase price. He ransoms her back from whoever it is she has sold herself to. It's an image of the picture of God and his gracious love. God will spend the next 4 chapters, from chapter 4 to chapter 13, speaking of this process by which he will use the judgment upon Israel and the judgment upon Judah, and how it's really a sign of his love. It's a sign of his love. There's a resilience to God's love that comes out of this book.